The explosion hit Harlow Military Medical Center at 2:47 in the afternoon. One second, the ward smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. The next, the East Corridor was a wall of fire and screaming. Armed men in tactical gear poured through the breach before the smoke even settled. Everyone froze. The doctors, the orderlies, the decorated officers in their hospital beds. Everyone except the quiet one. The rookie. The nurse they'd been mocking all week. She didn't scream, didn't run. She pulled a rifle from a downed security guard, raised it in one fluid motion, and put a single round through the lead attacker's shoulder before he could execute the man he had pressed against the wall. The shot was perfect. Surgical. Military. And in that moment, absolutely nobody in Harlow Military Medical Center knew who they had been ignoring. But if you're watching this for the first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this one don't come around often, and I'd hate for you to miss what's coming. Tap the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment below telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because before that shot, before that explosion, there was a woman nobody thought was worth remembering. Mara Voss arrived in Dunmore, Wyoming on a Tuesday morning in February, driving a dented pickup truck with a cracked passenger mirror and a duffel bag that held everything she owned. The town was the kind of place that existed primarily on road signs and military payroll. Harlow. Military Medical Center was its entire economy, its entire identity, and its entire reason for having a gas station worth stopping at. She'd requested the transfer herself. That part was important. Most nurses fought to get out of remote postings. Mara had specifically asked for one. The assignment officer in Denver had looked at her paperwork twice, asked if she was sure, and when she said yes, he'd shrugged and signed it without another word. He had no reason to look deeper. Her military nursing credentials were current, her civilian recertification was clean, and her references, two former hospital supervisors whose names meant nothing to him, checked out fine. What the paperwork didn't mention, and what Mara had no intention of discussing, was the 11 years before any of that. She checked in at the nurses' station on the third floor of the medical ward at 7:50 a.m., 10 minutes before her shift was supposed to start. The charge nurse behind the desk was a heavy-set woman named Diane Pruitt, who had been running the ward since before Mara was born, or so she looked. She glanced up from her clipboard, looked Mara over once, the kind of look that cataloged and dismissed simultaneously, and said, "You're the new placement." Mara Voss, yes. "You've done military wards before?" "Some." Diane made a sound that wasn't quite a response. "We have 42 patients, 18 of them post-surgical, 3 in isolation, and 1 who's been trying to self-discharge since Monday. The doctors don't like to be interrupted during rounds unless someone's coding. The Marines don't like being treated by women, and most of them will let you know that in the first 5 minutes." She handed over a badge and a folded schedule. "Questions?" "Where's the supply room?" Diane pointed left down the hallway without looking up again. "End of the corridor. Don't move anything without signing the log." That was the entire orientation. Mara found her locker, changed into scrubs, and walked into the ward. The first patient she approached was a staff sergeant named Garrett Hobbs, 29 years old, femur fracture from a training accident, 3 days post-op and furious about all of it. He had a jaw like a tractor part, and the kind of eyes that had stopped seeing the inside of this room days ago and were already looking at wherever he was going next. He watched Mara approach with the particular expression of a man who has decided something before it starts. "You're new," he said. "Morning. I'm Mara. I'll be taking over your morning." "How long you been doing this?" She looked at his chart without answering the question directly. "How's the pain level since last night's dose?" "I asked you a question." "You did?" She made a note on the chart. "Pain level, 1 to 10? Hobbs stared at her for a moment, then said to the ceiling, "They sent me a rookie." From the next bed, a corporal named Dwyer, 22, bilateral arm fractures, bored out of his mind, laughed. "Probably graduated yesterday." Mara wrote down the time, capped her pen, and said, "Let's take care of the patients." Then she moved on to the next bed. She said it without edge, without the tight smile that would have given something away. She just moved on, checked the next chart, adjusted an IV drip that someone had set slightly wrong overnight, and kept going. It was the only version of herself she was willing to be here, Useful, quiet, unremarkable. That was the point. By the end of her first week, she had developed a general reputation. Not a good one, not a bad one, just a specific one. The nurses knew she was technically solid. The doctors appreciated that she didn't slow them down during rounds. The patients had sorted themselves into two camps, those who ignored her and those who were openly unimpressed. Hobbs had taken to calling her the intern whenever she walked past, loud enough for the room to hear. She never responded to it. What she did instead was work. She noticed things, small things, the kind that accumulated into a picture nobody else was drawing. She noticed that Corporal Dwyer flinched whenever a door slammed, in a way that had nothing to do with his fractures. She adjusted her approach in his room accordingly. Slower movements, more warning before anything that might startle, a general lowering of what she could lower. He never said thank you. He didn't have to. She noticed that the night security guard, a civilian contractor named Fulton, had been rotating his patrol times by about 20 minutes each night in a pattern that wasn't random. It was consistent. That was something she filed away without knowing exactly why, the way she'd learned to file things in places she couldn't quite name. She noticed that one of the external contractors who'd been doing electrical work in the East Corridor for the past 10 days had never once been questioned about why the work was taking so long. Electrical contractors moved room to room, left, came back. This one had been spending an unusual amount of time near the structural wall adjacent to the emergency generator room. She said nothing about any of it, because saying something would require explaining how she knew to notice, and that was a door she'd shut behind her a long time ago. The moment that changed the dynamic inside the ward came on the 8th day. It was a Thursday afternoon, low census hour, most of the medical staff either at lunch or in the back offices. Mara was doing medication rounds, nothing dramatic, just working through the patient list, when she reached the room of a 31-year-old lieutenant named Cassia Wren. Wren had been admitted 4 days ago for a severe infection following a field injury, the kind of infection that had started bad and was taking its time getting worse despite treatment. She'd been spiking fevers that didn't fully respond to the antibiotic protocol, and nobody on the day team had flagged it for adjustment yet. Mara stood at the doorway, looking at the chart for a moment longer than necessary. Then she walked in and checked the IV site, the drainage, the temperature log from the last 18 hours. The pattern was there if you knew what you were looking for. The antibiotic wasn't wrong. It just wasn't enough, or more precisely, it wasn't right for what this had become. She went to find the attending physician on call, Dr. Emmett Bryce, who was in the break room with a sandwich and an expression that made clear he considered the sandwich more urgent than most things currently happening in the hospital. Lieutenant Wren's infection markers from this morning don't match the response pattern from day 2, Mara said. I think we need to consider broadening the antibiotic coverage. Bryce looked at her for a second. And you are? Mara Voss? 3rd floor. Voss. He said the name like he was checking whether it matched anything in his mental filing system and coming up empty. The new placement. Yes. Her cultures came back with sensitivities already. She's on the right drug. The initial cultures did. But the fever pattern from the last 12 hours is inconsistent with what we'd expect if the primary pathogen was the only thing in play. Bryce set down his sandwich. He didn't look annoyed exactly, more the way someone looks when they've been interrupted by something that might technically be correct but is still inconvenient. You're suggesting a secondary infection without repeat cultures. I'm suggesting we order repeat cultures and consider bridging coverage while we wait. It's a 12-hour window either way. There was a pause. Then Bryce said, I'll review it after lunch. Mara nodded and left the room. He ordered the new cultures 40 minutes later. When they came back the following morning, they confirmed a secondary bacterial strain that would not have responded to the existing protocol. Wren was moved to a targeted regimen immediately and started improving within 24 hours. Bryce said nothing to Mara directly. He did, however, stop leaving her notes asking her to route clinical observations through Diane first. The ward adjusted, the way wards adjust. Not dramatically. Not with anyone sitting down and changing their opinion, just with a slight recalibration of who got listened to and when. Hobbs still called her the intern, but he said it with about 15% less certainty. Dwyer had started making eye contact when she came in the room. Small things. They didn't matter much. What mattered was that she was still invisible enough to work. And then Sergeant First Class Reuben Dacre arrived. Dacre came in on a Wednesday evening by medevac, transferred from another facility, hip and lower back injuries from a vehicle rollover that had been complicated by a pre-existing spinal condition nobody had properly documented. He was 44 years old, built like an architectural feature, and operated under a permanent expression of concentrated contempt that he distributed generously and without apparent effort. He was also in serious pain, which he refused to acknowledge in a way that was making his recovery actively worse. Mara was assigned to him on his second day. She walked in, introduced herself, and he looked at the ceiling. "Where's the male nurse they had yesterday?" "Off today. I'm covering the morning." "I want a male nurse." "I understand. I can ask Diane about reassignment for tomorrow's shift. This morning, I'm what's available." She moved to check his positioning because she'd already looked at his chart and the angle he was lying at was going to cause additional muscle strain on top of everything else. "Can you shift slightly?" "I said I want a male nurse." "I heard you." She kept her voice even. "Shift slightly to your left if you can, just a few degrees." He didn't move. She waited. Then she said, "The way you're positioned right now is putting compression on the left side of your lumbar, the part that's already inflamed. I know it doesn't feel like it matters. It will in about 2 hours." A pause. He shifted slightly to the left. Mara adjusted the pillow support beneath him and moved on without making anything of it. Over the following days, Dacre never stopped being difficult. But the difficulty changed character. He stopped demanding reassignment. He started answering her medical questions with something closer to accuracy, which was more useful than compliance. On the fourth day, when she walked in and he immediately said, "I've been running a fever since 3 a.m. and nobody's checked in." She pulled up a chair, sat down, and listened to him list every symptom in detail. The fever turned out to be the beginning of a secondary complication that they caught early because he told her about it and she'd taken it seriously. He didn't say thank you. He said, "You're not useless." From Dacre, that was functionally a medal. What Mara had not done in the entire 2 weeks since her arrival was explain herself to anyone. She had not told anyone where she'd trained, what she'd done before civilian nursing, or why a person with her skill set had chosen to drive a dented pickup truck to the most remote military medical center in Wyoming. She had her reasons. They were hers. The closest she came to a conversation about it was with a night shift nurse named Paloma Reyes, 26, 2 years out of nursing school, honest in the way that young people are before institutions teach them better. Paloma had developed the habit of catching Mara in the break room during shift change and talking, the way people talk when they're tired and the filters come down. "Where'd you work before this?" Paloma asked one night, around 1 a.m., both of them on their second coffee. "Different places." "Before nursing, I mean. What did you do?" Mara looked at her coffee cup for a second. "Different things." Paloma laughed. "You're the most private person I've ever met in a hospital, and that's saying something, because nurses know everything about each other by day 3. She paused. "Hobbs thinks you're a student who somehow got a job. Dacre told me you're competent but evasive, which I think is the nicest thing he said about a person this year." Mara smiled at that. It was a real smile, the slightly crooked kind that she didn't usually let out at work. "Competent but evasive is fine. What are you evasive about?" "Everything I haven't mentioned." Paloma shook her head, still smiling. "Fair enough." They drank their coffee. Outside the break room window, the parking lot was empty, and the sky was the kind of dark that only happened in places far enough from city light that the stars were actually visible. Mara had grown up somewhere like that. She didn't think about it often. Paloma said, "Can I ask one thing?" "You can ask." "The way you move, the way you assess things. It's not, I see nurses every day. You're doing something different. The way you watch the exits when you walk into a room. The thing you do where you always put your back to the wall in the break room." She looked directly at Mara. "That's not from nursing school." The silence stretched out for about 4 seconds. Then Mara said, "Get some sleep, Paloma. We've got a long shift tomorrow." She said it without closing the conversation down hard, just redirecting. Paloma nodded, took her coffee, and went back to the desk. Mara sat alone for another minute and stared out the window at the parking lot. The electrical contractor's truck was still there. It had been there for 3 consecutive nights now, parked in the far corner near the emergency generator intake. The man's name on the facility contractor roster was listed as Halverson. She'd looked. She'd also looked up whether there were any scheduled night electrical jobs in the East Corridor. There weren't. She told herself it was probably nothing. Contractors had logistical reasons for leaving vehicles. The parking lot was easier than driving back to wherever they stayed. She told herself that. She did not tell herself it very convincingly. She went back to work. The morning it happened was clear and cold, the sky the flat white of February in high elevation, and Harlow Military Medical Center was operating at standard tempo. Mara was in the middle of a wound assessment on Dacre's left hip when the first explosion hit the East Corridor with a sound that moved through the building like a physical thing, not just heard but felt, the kind of concussive force that rattled IV poles and sent ceiling tiles cracking at their seams. The alarm systems came on, then went off. Then came on again in a fragmented way that told Mara what she needed to know before she'd processed a single other detail. The power had been partially cut, and the backup systems were running on emergency only. Someone had hit the generator room. Dacre, flat on his back and unable to move quickly, said, "That was not a gas line." "No," Mara agreed. She was already at the door looking down the corridor. The smoke came first, black and thick, the kind that came from burning tactical gear and accelerant rather than insulation or wire. Then came the sounds, boots, multiple sets, moving fast and organized, and then a voice through a bullhorn that hadn't come from any security team she'd ever seen in this facility. "Nobody moves. Everyone on the floor. Do it now." 3 armed men in black came into the ward entrance at the end of the corridor. Tactical gear, face coverings, weapons up and scanning. Not desperate, not panicked, methodical. These were not opportunists. These were people who had planned this with significant care and were now executing the plan. The nurse at the station near the entrance, a young man named Torres who had never been in anything like this in his life, put his hands up and stepped back. One of the men swept him aside and moved to the station console. He wasn't looking for drugs. He was looking for something else, and he found it in about 12 seconds. The hospital's internal communication system. Mara stepped back from the doorway. Dacre was watching her. "What are you doing?" "Thinking." "About what?" She looked at him, at his chart, at the door, and then at the wall panel that controlled the room's call system and lighting. She walked to it and cut the call signal. Not visibly, just a toggle that would make this room appear offline to the station. It would buy time. It wasn't a plan, just the beginning of one. "How mobile are you right now?" she asked him. Dacre's jaw tightened. "I can sit up." "That's going to have to be enough." She pulled the privacy curtain across the window panel in the door. A small thing, unremarkable, the kind of thing nurses did 100 times a day. Then she moved to the next room, where Corporal Dwyer was already sitting up in bed with the look of a man whose entire nervous system had just come fully online. "What's happening?" Dwyer asked. "Armed entry. Stay low. Stay quiet." She checked his mobility. Both arms still in external fixation, limited use. "When I tell you to move, you move. Not before." "Yes, ma'am." She went to the next room, and the next. The corridor behind her was filling with sounds, shouting, the crash of equipment, someone screaming in the direction of the surgical unit 2 floors down. In the supply closet off the East Hall, she found what she'd noted on her first day without knowing she was noting it. A locked emergency cabinet that hospital security protocols required in all military medical facilities above a certain classification level. She had the master key because she was a nurse, and nurses had master keys. And the combination to the emergency cabinet because she had memorized it from the laminated card Diane had given her during orientation and never asked her to return. She opened the cabinet. Inside, a standard trauma kit, emergency communications beacon, and 1 security issue sidearm in a sealed case, placed there by regulation for extreme circumstances, the kind that the facility had probably never expected to actually use. She looked at it for 1 second. Outside the supply closet, she heard the sound of the bullhorn again. Different corridor now, closer. And then gunfire. 2 shots, somewhere on the floor below. She took the sidearm. She was back in the corridor in under 30 seconds, moving low and fast toward the East Ward entrance. And the 2 men she passed on her way didn't register her as a threat until she was already past them, because she looked like a nurse, moving quickly in scrubs, head down, the way medical staff always moved in a crisis. The security guard at the end of the hall, the one the lead attacker had been pressing against the wall when she'd first looked out, His name was Ernie Gallegos, 20 years with facility security, a man who showed Mara pictures of his grandchildren at least once a week, was still alive. On his knees, hands behind his head, the weapon from his own holster pointed at the back of his neck by a man who was not looking anywhere else. Mara came around the corner with the sidearm up. The shot was clean. The attacker went down with a shoulder wound, not a kill shot, because she needed him alive and she had made that decision before she rounded the corner. Gallegos dropped flat from pure instinct. The man with the shoulder wound hit the floor and she was already moving past him, kicking his weapon away, pulling Gallegos up by the arm. "Get to the east stairwell," she said. "Lock it from the inside and don't open it unless you hear 2 knocks followed by 3. Got it?" Gallegos stared at her. "Voss, 2 and 3. Go." He went. She turned back toward the ward and found herself standing in the open corridor with a weapon and a choice. Down the hall, she could hear the armed men reorganizing, could hear the specific cadence of a team realizing one of their own had just gone down, which meant a response was coming in roughly the next 45 to 90 seconds. From the ward behind her came the sound of Dacre's voice, rough and carrying. "Voss!" She turned. He was in the doorway of his room, vertical against all medical advice, one hand braced on the frame. He looked at her, at the weapon, at the way she was standing, at the calculation clearly running behind her eyes. And his expression changed in the specific way that experienced soldiers' expressions changed when they recognized something they hadn't expected to see. He said very quietly, "Who are you?" She had no time to answer that question. Down the corridor, the sound of boots was getting louder. She didn't answer him. There wasn't time, and even if there had been, she wasn't sure what she would have said. The boots were 40 seconds away, maybe less, and the corridor geometry gave her exactly one viable option: move forward or cede the ground she'd already taken. She looked at Docker in the doorway, a man held vertical by stubbornness and very little else, and made a fast decision. "Back in the bed, on your side facing the wall. Don't move unless I tell you." "You're going toward them." "Back in the bed, Dacre." He looked at her for another second with that recalibrated expression, the one that had replaced whatever he'd been running before. Then he turned and lowered himself back toward the mattress with the careful, grinding effort of a man negotiating with a body that had already filed several formal complaints. Mara was already moving. The corridor junction 20 feet ahead was a T-intersection, east wing meeting the central hub. She knew the layout. She'd walked every corridor in this facility within the first 48 hours of arriving, the way she always walked new spaces, building the map she kept in the part of her brain that never fully stood down. The armed team coming from the central hub would have to slow at the junction to split their formation. That was the only mechanical advantage she had, and it was thin. She pressed flat against the wall to the left of the junction and listened. 4 sets of footsteps. Moving tight, the way trained people moved when they were covering a hostile environment and expecting contact. They were communicating in short bursts, hand signals probably, or earpieces, not voice, because she couldn't hear words, just the occasional low click that might have been a radio break signal. She had 1 magazine, 12 rounds, 3 already used in the corridor, 9 remaining. She ran the math without meaning to. It was the kind of calculation that happened before she consciously chose to make it. The first man came around the corner fast and low. She dropped him with a sweep to the legs that had nothing to do with the weapon in her hand, used the sidearm as a block against his rifle barrel, took his forward momentum, redirected it, and he went down hard onto his shoulder with a sound like someone dropping a full kit bag. The weapon skittered. She had his arm in a lock before he'd registered the ground, and by the time the second man came around the corner, she was using the first as partial cover. The second man stopped. This happened in under 3 seconds total. "Weapon down," she said. Her voice was completely level. That was training, not nerve. There was a difference, and the way her hands were very slightly not steady was the proof of it. She was running on adrenaline and muscle memory, and she knew exactly how long that particular combination was reliable for. The second man did not put his weapon down. From somewhere deeper in the facility, an alarm changed pitch. Not the fire suppression system, something else. A different tone, the kind that meant communications lockdown. Her stomach dropped a precise and specific amount because she understood what that meant. The men currently executing this operation had just triggered the facility's external communication block. Whatever was happening inside Harlow Military Medical Center was now happening in a sealed box. No outgoing calls, no radio signals, no way to tell anyone on the outside what was occurring in here. The second gunman seemed to understand she'd understood because something in his posture shifted, not toward violence, but toward a kind of calculated patience that was arguably worse. He said, in accented English that she couldn't immediately place, "Put the gun down, nurse. Not going to happen. The building is ours. Communications are down. Whatever you're planning—" "I'm not planning anything," Mara said. "I'm buying time." She pressed the man on the ground into an awkward angle that made him grunt with pain, and she used that grunt as cover for the movement of her left hand toward the wall panel at her elbow. Emergency medical alert. Hardwired to the system, separate circuit from the main communications network, because the original facility designers had correctly identified that losing medical alert in a blackout was a serious problem. She didn't know if the external array was also cut. She pressed the button anyway. Then she released the man on the ground, took 2 steps back toward the ward corridor, and said, "Tell your commander there's a nurse in the East Wing who'd like to negotiate." It was a delay tactic, not a very good one, but it was what she had. She moved fast back toward the ward. Paloma met her at the ward entrance, eyes wide, voice barely above a whisper. "There are at least 6 of them on the second floor. They have Dr. Bryce and 3 other staff members. I counted 4 patients in the central ward who can't be moved. Mara, what is happening?" Organized assault, multiple teams, pre-planned entry. She was already moving through the ward, checking rooms in sequence. "Are any of the mobile patients still in their rooms?" "Hobbs left his bed about 5 minutes ago. I don't know where he went." "Find him. Get everyone who can move to the back supply corridor. Quietly." Paloma stared at her for one more second. "Who?" "Mara, who are you?" "Right now I'm the person making the decisions. Go." Paloma went. Mara moved through the ward with the sidearm held low, checking corners from angles that no nurse should have known to use. The problem she was working was a logistics problem with a time component. She had approximately 16 to 20 patients on this floor, ranging from fully mobile to completely immobile. The attackers had at minimum 6 confirmed personnel, possibly more, operating on at least 2 floors. The communications blackout meant no cavalry was coming on a known timetable, and she had 9 rounds and no clear picture of the objective. That last part bothered her most. This wasn't a robbery. The weapons weren't pointed at a pharmacy or a pharmaceutical storage room. The man she'd heard on the bullhorn had directed people to the ground, not to specific locations, and the communication system had been targeted first, which meant the priority was containment, not acquisition. They were here for something, or someone, specific. She was turning that over when she found Hobbs. He was in the housekeeping closet 3 rooms down from his own, sitting on an upturned mop bucket, with a fire extinguisher in one hand and the expression of a man who had been waiting for an excuse to do something about a situation for several minutes now. He'd clearly made it this far on sheer aggravated determination, because his left leg was in no condition to be carrying him anywhere at all. He looked at the sidearm in her hand, then at her face. "It's you," he said. Not a question, just a recalibration, the same one she'd seen on Dacre, coming a little slower through the particular filter of someone who had spent 2 weeks having a specific opinion about her. "Can you walk?" Define walk. Move without falling down. He stood up, tested the leg, and his face did something complicated. "Mostly." "Come with me. Don't use the extinguisher unless I tell you to." It was a plan. It was the beginning of a plan. "Come on." She moved out of the closet with Hobbs limping close behind, and found Paloma in the back corridor with 8 patients in various states of mobility, 3 in wheelchairs, 2 on crutches, 3 moving under their own power but looking like they'd regret it tomorrow. Dwyer was among them, arms still in fixation, face set with the flat focus of someone who had processed the situation and filed everything non-essential. "Dacre?" Mara asked. "Still in his room. He said he wasn't moving without your order and also that you'd explain later what the hell is going on." That was so precisely Dacre that it settled something very slightly. She moved to the supply corridor's emergency exit, a heavy door that led to the exterior maintenance stairwell on the building's north face. Not an escape route, not exactly, because the north maintenance stairwell opened into a narrow service lane between the main building and the generator annex, which was almost certainly occupied by hostiles given that the generator room had been the first thing hit. But it was a staging point that wasn't on the standard facility map, because it was listed in the maintenance documentation rather than the medical floor plans. She didn't think they'd have gotten hold of the maintenance documentation. She held the door open a fraction and looked. The service lane was empty. Generator annex door was closed. No visible personnel. "Through the door," she said quietly. "Stay against the north wall. Don't move past the second maintenance junction." "Where are you going?" Paloma asked. "Back." Dacre can't self-evacuate. I need 2 minutes." She pressed the sidearm into Paloma's hand. The younger nurse looked at it like it had appeared from another dimension. "Point and squeeze. Don't do it unless something comes through that door that isn't me." She went back through the ward. Dacre was in his room, exactly where she'd left him, lying on his side facing the wall with the rigid stillness of a man who had decided to comply with instructions and found it deeply against his nature. He heard her come in and said, without turning, "How bad?" "Bad enough. Can you do a wheelchair or do you need a stretcher?" "Wheelchair." He said it like it cost him something. "What's outside?" "A service lane. Not ideal, but it's not in their coverage pattern." She was already getting the chair from the wall mount, unfolding it, bringing it to the side of the bed. "I need you to get into this chair without audible expression of pain." "That's a tall order." "I know." He made it into the chair in about 30 seconds, and she had to give him credit. The only sound was a sharp exhale through his teeth that he killed halfway through. She wheeled him out of the room, through the supply corridor, and through the emergency exit door. The group was against the north wall where she'd left them. Paloma handed the sidearm back immediately with visible relief. Mara did a head count. 11. 2 additional patients had apparently mobilized themselves in the time she'd been gone. She recognized one of them, a lieutenant named Ferris, who had a concussion and absolutely should not have been upright, and decided not to address that particular clinical issue right now. Hobbs, leaning against the wall with the fire extinguisher still in hand, said quietly, "What are they after?" "I don't know yet." "Best guess." She thought about it for a real second. "Someone in this building, or something someone in this building has access to." The silence that followed was the kind where people processed options and didn't like any of them. Then Dwyer said from somewhere in the middle of the group, "Lieutenant Colonel Reyes is on the 2nd floor. He arrived yesterday. I saw him check in when they brought my dinner tray." Mara looked at him. "What's Reyes assigned to?" Dwyer hesitated. "I don't know exactly, but when he checked in, he had 2 men with him who weren't medical staff, and they swept the room before he went in." That landed with weight. A military officer with a protective detail checked in under what she assumed was minimal fanfare, 2 days after an electrical contractor started spending unusual amounts of time near the generator room. The picture was forming, and it was not a comfortable picture. Whatever was on the 2nd floor in room 214, which she already knew was Reyes's room, because she'd noted the assignment when she'd seen the 2 non-medical men moving through the corridor on his arrival, was the reason this building was currently under armed occupation by a team that had prepared for months. She looked out at the 11 people in the service lane, then back at the building. If she stayed here, she might be able to keep this group quiet long enough for the hardwired emergency alert to pull a response from somewhere. 30 minutes, maybe 45. If the alert had even gone through. If it hadn't been cut along with everything else. If she went back in, she was one person with a sidearm and diminishing rounds, moving through a building occupied by a minimum of 6 armed and trained personnel. Neither option was good. She had learned a long time ago in places she no longer talked about that the absence of good options was not the same thing as the absence of options, and the relevant discipline was sorting the bad ones in the right order. Hobbs was watching her face. "You're going back in." "I'm going to the 2nd floor." "To do what?" "To find out if Reyes is still alive and what they actually want. If I know what they want, I can figure out what they'll trade." She looked at him directly. "Can you keep this group in the lane?" Hobbs straightened up. Something about the question changed his posture. Not physically, because the leg clearly wouldn't allow physical dignity right now, but in the way he was holding himself. "Yeah, I've got it." She looked at Docker. "Go," he said, before she could ask. "We're not going anywhere." She went back through the door. The second floor was quieter than she'd expected, which was its own kind of bad. Quiet meant controlled. She took the maintenance stairwell that connected to the north utility shaft. Not a real stairwell, just a ladder access route for HVAC maintenance, barely wide enough for a person moving without a pack, which she was. She came up through a utility panel in the second floor corridor ceiling and dropped into the hallway in a section between the two security camera positions she'd identified on her mental map. The corridor was empty of staff, not of people. Two armed men stood outside a room at the far end. Not room 214, which was where Reyes was supposed to be. Room 211. The door to 214 was open and appeared empty, which meant Reyes had either been moved, or Dwyer's information about his room assignment had been wrong, or Reyes himself had moved when the shooting started and someone had found him. From inside 211, she could hear voices. She moved along the wall to the door of 213, which was between her and the two guards, and stepped inside. Empty room, bed stripped, recently discharged patient. She moved to the connecting utility door that all rooms on this corridor shared for maintenance access. It was the kind of thing only facility staff knew about, and only the ones who'd read the building schematics, which she'd found in the maintenance office on her third day, and spent 20 minutes reviewing for reasons she hadn't fully articulated to herself at the time. Through the thin wall of 213, she could hear the conversation in 211 clearly enough. A male voice she didn't recognize. "Won't matter where they moved it. You have access. You've had access for 6 months." A second voice, strained and attempting steadiness. "I don't know what you think I can give you." She recognized the second voice. She'd heard it only once, briefly, in the corridor during his arrival. Reyes. The first voice again. "The package doesn't leave this building without your authentication. We know that. You know that. Let's stop wasting each other's time." Package. Authentication. She was building a picture she didn't have all the pieces for yet, but the pieces she had were pointing somewhere specific. Reyes wasn't just a military officer recovering from something. He was here with authority over something that these men needed his access to release or authorize, which meant he was the only person in this building they couldn't kill until they'd gotten what they needed from him, which meant he had leverage, even as a captive, which meant there was a clock. The first voice, harder now. "We can do this in a way that's acceptable to everyone in this room, or we can do it in a way that is not. Your choice. But this is the last time I phrase it as a choice." Mara pressed her back against the wall of room 213 and thought for exactly 4 seconds. Then she moved to the door of 213, opened it a precise 2 inches, and looked at the two guards in the corridor. They were positioned outside 211 facing the door. The standard placement that covered entry to the room, but created a blind spot to the left along the corridor wall. She needed 8 feet of movement to reach the utility junction that accessed the building's main data line conduit. The hardwired emergency alert she'd pressed earlier had sent a signal on a dedicated circuit, but it was a single-tone alert. It said emergency, not specifics. Anything else, any actual communication, required the building's data line, which ran through that conduit. 8 feet, 2 guards, blind spot to the left. She was 2 steps out the door when the thing she hadn't planned for happened. The building's fire suppression system, not the alarms, the actual suppression, the sprinklers, came on in the corridor, all of them, simultaneously. Mara froze for exactly half a second, soaked in the first spray. The guards both turned instinctively, heads up, scanning. And in that half second of turning heads and spray confusion, someone hit the first guard from behind with a fire extinguisher delivered at significant velocity by a man who absolutely should not have climbed a second-floor staircase on a fractured femur. Hobbs brought the extinguisher down, and the guard went sideways and down in a collision of noise that was immediately swallowed by the fire suppression alarm. Mara was already moving. She took the second guard with a controlled takedown that left him face down and disarmed in about 4 seconds, grabbed the radio off his vest, and turned to find Hobbs standing in the corridor doorway, looking like he might pass out from either pain or effort or both. Leaning on the wall with one hand, extinguisher in the other, jaw set at an angle that suggested he was having a conversation with his own nervous system and winning only narrowly. "I told you to stay in the lane," she said. "I did," he said. "Then I came up the stairs." He looked at the guard on the floor, then at her. "That was fast." "Hobbs, the lane is fine. Dacre has it." His voice had the particular compressed quality of someone managing severe pain through sheer indignation. I figured you might need... He stopped, swallowed. I figured someone had to do something. She looked at him for a second. There was nothing she could say about the leg that he didn't already know, and no time to say it anyway, so she said the thing that was actually true. Good call on the sprinklers. He blinked. I didn't do the sprinklers. She stared at him. From down the corridor a voice, young, slightly shaky, unmistakably deliberate. I did. Paloma was standing at the end of the hall with a fire suppression manual override panel hanging open on the wall beside her, soaking wet, holding the sidearm in both hands with the grip of someone who was afraid of it and doing it anyway. Mara opened her mouth and then closed it. You left, Paloma said, and then Hobbs left. And I didn't know what else to do, so I looked at the panel. She glanced at the override. The manual trigger is yellow. It said so on the label. A 4-second silence during which the sprinklers continued. The radio in Mara's hand crackled with someone asking for a status check, and from inside room 211 came the sound of a chair being knocked over, followed by raised voices reacting to the water and the noise. Mara pressed transmit on the radio and said nothing. Then she released it. Static. From the commander inside the room, the first voice, the one she'd heard talking to Reyes, came a specific quality of silence that preceded someone reassessing everything they thought they knew about the situation. Mara looked at Paloma, at Hobbs, at the door of room 211. The radio crackled again. Sector 2, confirm. What is your status? She pressed transmit again. Let it breathe for 1 second. Then said, in a voice calibrated to sound like a man's, rough and clipped, Sector 2 clear. Sprinklers tripped by the suppression line. We're managing. A pause on the other end. Then, find out where the control overrides are and kill the water. Commander Vreth is not happy. Vreth. She had a name now. She released the radio. Hobbs, still against the wall, said quietly, How long does that buy us? 3 minutes, she said. Maybe 4. And then? She looked at the door of room 211, where Vreth was holding a lieutenant colonel, who was the only person in this building with authentication for something significant enough that a professional armed team had planned and executed an occupation operation to get it. 3 minutes. She needed a data line, a clear signal, and 45 seconds to transmit a location ping with enough embedded information that whoever received it on the other end would understand what was happening inside this building and respond accordingly. The data conduit junction was 12 feet away. She handed the radio to Hobbs, told Paloma to stay at the end of the corridor and call out if anyone came up the main stairwell, and moved to the conduit panel. It took her 60 seconds to access the line, longer than she wanted because her hands were wet from the sprinklers, and the panel housing was a model she was less familiar with than she'd have liked. But it opened. Inside, the data line ran alongside the power distribution channel exactly as the building schematics had shown. She needed 2 things from the contents of the guard's vest she'd taken: a signal splitter and a transmitter. The splitter was there. It was standard kit for teams doing communications interdiction, which is exactly what they were. They'd brought tools to cut signals. She was going to use one of those tools to push a signal through the gap in the cut they hadn't closed perfectly, because no comm blackout executed in the field was ever perfectly closed. And if you knew where to look for the seam, you could get something through. She found the seam. Her hands were still not entirely steady. She was aware of that as a fact rather than a crisis. The adrenaline had been running for nearly 20 minutes, and the body made its own adjustments regardless of what the mind preferred. She worked through it. The ping took 11 seconds to configure and 3 to transmit. What it carried was a location identifier, a facility code, a threat level flag, and a string of characters that she had memorized from a sequence she hadn't thought about in 3 years, which corresponded to a call sign she had no business still having but had never formally been stripped of. Whether anyone on the other end was still listening for that call sign was the variable she couldn't control. She closed the panel. Hobbs, from the corridor. Mara. She turned. The door to room 211 was open. Commander Vreth was standing in the doorway. He was a large man, mid-50s, with the particular physical economy of someone who had operated in hostile environments for a very long time and had nothing left to prove about it. He was wet from the sprinklers, which should have made him look less composed, and somehow hadn't. He looked at Mara, at the open conduit panel, at Hobbs with the fire extinguisher, at Paloma at the end of the corridor. Then he looked back at Mara with an expression she couldn't entirely read, except for the part that was recognition. "You sent a signal," he said. "I sent a signal. Through our blackout. Through the seam in your blackout." She kept her voice even. "You didn't close the distribution channel gap. The schematics for this building's COM architecture show a secondary data line running parallel to the power distribution channel. It's a design artifact from a 2009 renovation. Easy to miss if you're working from the current facility maps rather than the original building documentation." Vreth looked at her for a long moment. "Who are you?" he said. She'd been asked that question 3 times in the last 45 minutes by 3 different people. She still didn't have an answer she was ready to give, and now Vreth was moving. Not toward her, not yet, but the 2 armed men who appeared in the doorway behind him were already repositioning, and down the corridor she could hear the sound of the 3rd team converging on their position from the south stairwell, boots and purpose, cutting off the exit she'd been calculating since she'd come up through the utility panel. The radio in Hobbs's hand crackled again, but the voice on it wasn't from Vreth's team. The voice was external, a different frequency. Breaking through the blackout on the exact channel she'd known would be open if someone on the outside had received her signal and pushed back through the gap with enough power to overcome the interdiction field. It said, "In the flat-controlled register of military communications. Harlow Medical, this is Kestrel Actual. We have your beacon. ETA 14 minutes. Hold on." The silence in the corridor was the kind that had weight and texture. Vreth's expression did not change, but something behind it did. Mara said very quietly, 14 minutes. He looked at her, then at the conduit panel, then back at her. "You knew that frequency," he said. Not an accusation, something closer to the beginning of a question he wasn't sure he wanted finished. From the end of the corridor, Paloma let out a breath that was almost a laugh and almost something else entirely. And from inside room 211, Lieutenant Colonel Reyes's voice came through the open door, shaken but distinctly alive. "Vreth, I think you have a problem." Vreth didn't move immediately, which told her more than movement would have. A man like Vreth. She was reading him fast, the way she'd learned to read people in environments where misreading cost more than time. A man like him moved when he'd decided, and the fact that he hadn't decided yet meant the 14-minute variable had introduced a calculation he hadn't planned for. Professional armed teams operated on contingency logic. If primary fails, secondary. But the secondary assumed a sealed environment, and the environment was no longer sealed, and the people who'd built his secondary plan hadn't accounted for a seam in a communications blackout that only someone with very specific knowledge would have known to look for. He was revising. She could see it. She used the revision window. "Your timeline just changed," she said. "Whatever you needed from Reyes, authentication, access, a code, a signature, whatever it is, you had a window to get it before any external response was possible. That window is now 13 minutes and shrinking. You can spend those 13 minutes trying to get what you came for from a man who has actively refused you since you locked him in that room, or you can make a different decision." Vreth looked at her with an expression that had become entirely unreadable, which was its own kind of answer. Behind him, the 2 men in the doorway were waiting for something from him. A signal, a word, a shift in posture, and not getting it yet. "Different decision," he said. "Walk out, leave Reyes, leave the staff. The external team arriving doesn't know your full count or your exit routes yet. You have options that will not exist in 12 minutes. It was not a speech. She wasn't trying to move him emotionally. She was presenting a logistics argument to a logistics mind, because that was the only language that had any chance of working, and she knew it. Vreth said, "You sent a call sign with that ping." She said nothing. A specific call sign, one that would have been retired. He looked at her with something that had shifted from assessment into a different register entirely. Unless the person who held it was still active, in some capacity, somewhere. The corridor was very quiet except for the sprinklers, which were beginning to cycle down. The suppression system had a 12-minute default runtime on manual trigger. When the water stopped, the ambient cover it was providing, the noise, the disruption, the visual interference, went with it. She was aware of all of this. She was also aware of Hobbs to her right, Paloma at the far end of the corridor, and the 2 men in the doorway behind Vreth, and the sound of a third team she could no longer hear on the south stairwell, which meant they'd stopped moving, which meant they were waiting for orders from the man currently standing in front of her. "Make your decision," she said. Vreth looked at her for one more second. Then he said, to the men behind him, something she didn't catch. 2 words, clipped, and they moved. Not toward her. Back into the room. She thought for a fraction of a second that it was going to be a withdrawal. Then the lights went out. Complete blackout. Not the partial failure from the initial generator hit. Total. Every emergency circuit, every backup pathway, killed simultaneously, which meant they'd had a secondary cut already wired, and Vreth had just triggered it. The building went from dim emergency lighting to absolute darkness in under a second. She moved. Not toward where Vreth had been standing. That would be where they expected her. She moved right, low, toward the wall, and covered the distance to the utility panel in 4 steps by memory, by the floor plan she'd built in the first 48 hours, by nothing more reliable than the spatial logic of having walked this corridor enough times in enough lights to know where the wall met the junction. Behind her, she heard Hobbs curse, heard a crash that was probably the fire extinguisher meeting a floor, heard Paloma's voice say something sharp and frightened, and then cut it off herself. The darkness was not equal for everyone. Vreth's team had gear for this. She did not. She had floor plan memory and the 3-second advantage of having moved before they expected it. She hit the utility panel at shoulder height, felt the seam by touch, and pulled the maintenance hatch open. The crawl space beyond was a horizontal run about 4 feet wide and 8 inches taller than necessary for a person moving flat, which ran parallel to the main corridor ceiling for the entire length of the wing before dropping into the vertical utility shaft she'd used to come up. She went in. Moving through a maintenance crawl in complete darkness, with wet hands and a sidearm she couldn't risk discharging in a confined metal space, was not a scenario she'd trained for in any formal sense. She'd done things adjacent to it, in places she didn't name out loud, in circumstances she'd spent 2 years trying to put some distance between herself and the muscle memory was there anyway. It was always there. That was the problem with muscle memory. It didn't respect the distance you tried to put between yourself and the moments that created it. She moved by counting feet and tracking direction changes, 50 feet to the vertical shaft, then 12 feet down, then the horizontal run to the main building junction, where the facility's primary structural wiring ran alongside a cable conduit she could use to navigate toward the east wing ground floor. She was counting and moving when she heard them enter the crawl space behind her. One person, by the sound. Moving faster than she was because they had light. A small one, the pinpoint kind that equipment mounted IR through when you had the optics for it, which she couldn't see but which told her they had thermal or light enhancement capability. The crawl space was a confined linear environment. No branches for 30 feet ahead. She was visible to anyone with the right equipment, and she had exactly 0 cover. She stopped. Thought for 2 seconds. Thought about the crawl space dimensions, about the IR optics that needed a minimum focal distance to resolve a clear image, about the fact that thermal red body temperature in degrees and wet scrubs over a body that had been running hot from adrenaline for 20+ minutes would read like a torch. She turned around. In the complete darkness, facing back toward the hatch she'd entered through, with someone coming toward her with light enhancement equipment, she stayed flat against the left wall of the crawl space and waited until she could hear the breathing. 3 feet. Maybe less. The small pinpoint light was somewhere in the person's peripheral field, not aimed directly ahead. They were scanning, not locked on. She caught the shape of a shoulder in what little the pin throw illuminated. She moved on the shoulder. It was ugly and confined, and nothing about it was controlled the way a trained engagement was supposed to be controlled, which was the entire point of a crawl space as a tactical environment. She got the weapon arm, pushed the muzzle into the wall. The discharge was deafening in the metal enclosure and went wide, sparks off the wall, got her knee into the person's center mass, and used the confined geometry to pin them against the right wall while she got the weapon free. The light-enhanced optic clattered somewhere in the dark. The person underneath her was not as big as they'd seemed from the shoulder. She registered that in the first contact, lighter, quicker response, which meant she had to adjust pressure and angle in the first 2 seconds or lose the pin. She adjusted. "Stop," she said, flat, close to the person's ear. They stopped. She took the weapon, pushed back, and said, "Move. Forward. toward the shaft. A pause. Then the person moved. In the darkness, she navigated by following their movement and counting the feet she'd already counted, and when they reached the vertical shaft, she reached past them and found the ladder rungs by touch and said, "Down." They went down. She followed. At the bottom, in the ground floor utility corridor, the emergency lighting was on. A single red strip running along the baseboard, enough to see shapes. The person she'd taken through the crawl space turned around and she saw the face. It was one of Vreth's men. Young, maybe 25, with the close-cut hair and particular physical economy of someone who'd been doing this since he was 18. He was looking at her with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite respect, but was in the territory between them. I was also bleeding from a cut above his ear where his head had hit the crawl space wall during the initial pin. She looked at the cut, then at him. It was superficial. It was also bleeding with the enthusiasm that scalp wounds specialized in, tracking down his jaw and dripping. She reached into the cargo pocket of her scrubs. She kept a folded gauze square there, a bit from the first week she'd ever worked a trauma bay, and pressed it against the cut without asking him. He flinched. "Hold that," she said. He raised his hand slowly and pressed the gauze. The look on his face cycled through several things, none of which he appeared to have prepared language for. "What's your name?" she asked. A pause. "Cade." "Cade. How many people does Vreth have in this building total?" He said nothing. He triggered the secondary blackout and sent one person into a crawl space after me, which means he's shifted from containment to active pursuit of a specific target rather than maintaining position on Reyes. She looked at him steadily. That's a tactical change, and tactical changes in the middle of an operation like this happen for one of two reasons. Either the original objective is becoming unachievable, and he's cutting losses, or something changed his priority. Which is it? Cade looked at the gauze he was holding to his head, then at the red emergency strip on the floor, then back at her. "He got a message," Cade said. "About 4 minutes before the blackout, on the secure line. We all heard him take it." "Who from?" "I don't know. He doesn't share the chain above him." The words came out with the particular flatness of someone who has decided that the organization they work for has just made choices that remove their personal obligation to it. But after he took it, his priority shifted from Reyes to you. That sat in the utility corridor with them for about 3 seconds. Whoever had received her call sign on the other end of the ping, whoever Kestrel Actual was, that incoming response hadn't just told the people outside what was happening inside the building. It had apparently told someone else something about who had sent it, and that information had traveled faster than 14 minutes along a chain of communication that Vreth was connected to. They weren't after Reyes anymore. They were after her. She took a breath and held it for exactly 1 second, released it. "How many people?" she said again. Cade looked at her. Then, 8 total. 2 on the first floor east, 2 holding Reyes on the second floor, 2 at the building exits, Vreth and 1 other in the north corridor. "Where's the 1 other?" "I was the 1 other." He gestured at the crawl space above them with his free hand. 7 accounted for. 1. The man she'd dropped in the east wing ground floor with a shoulder wound when this started, was presumably immobile or restrained. The man she'd taken down outside room 211 with Hobbs. That left 5 mobile personnel plus Vreth. She ran the building layout against the personnel positions. The 2 on the first floor east were between her current position and the maintenance stairwell that connected to the north service lane where the rest of the patients were. The 2 holding Reyes on the second floor were the immediate threat to the 1 person in this building whose survival was operationally non-negotiable, and Vreth, somewhere in the north corridor, was the center of gravity. She looked at Cade. "Can you walk?" "Yes. You're going to walk out the south utility exit, which is 40 feet east of your current position. You're going to sit down outside and not move until the external team arrives. If you attempt anything else, I'll know, because I'll hear you, and this corridor does not have any other exits at this level." He looked at her. "You're letting me go. I'm removing you from a situation where someone might shoot you in the next 10 minutes through no fault of your own." She handed him back his weapon with the magazine removed. "The magazine is in my pocket. The weapon is for show if you need it to get past anyone who doesn't know you." He took it slowly, held it, looked at her again with that expression she still didn't have a clean label for. "Who are you?" he said. The same question. The 4th person to ask it. Go, she said. He went. She turned back toward the east first-floor corridor and moved. The two men on the first floor east were positioned at the junction between the main medical corridor and the administrative wing. A logical placement if you were controlling building movement, less logical if the objective had just shifted from area control to individual pursuit, because it left them stationed for a purpose that was no longer the priority. Vreth hadn't updated their positioning. That was either a failure of communication in the blackout or a deliberate choice to maintain the appearance of original operational structure while he pivoted. She used the 3-minute window that uncertainty created. She came through the housekeeping corridor that ran behind the East administrative offices. Narrow, smelling of cleaning solution, lit only by the red emergency strip, and came up behind the East junction from the maintenance access door that connected the housekeeping corridor to the supply distribution point. Through the thin wall, she could hear one of the two men talking in low tones, not into a radio, to the other one. They were passing time, which meant nobody had updated them. She didn't engage them. She went under. The basement mechanical corridor ran the full length of the building's east-west axis, accessible through a floor-level maintenance hatch inside the supply distribution room that she'd noted on day 3 when she'd been signing out equipment and had asked the supply clerk, half out of curiosity, what the hatch connected to. The clerk had said mechanical, and shrugged, and she'd said of course, and filed it in the part of her brain that kept files. She dropped down, moved through the mechanical corridor at a run, crouching, because the ceiling clearance was designed for pipe runs and not people, and came up through the corresponding hatch on the north end of the building directly into the ground floor north corridor, 12 feet from the north utility exit. She came through it and into the cold. The service lane was dark and empty at first contact, which made her stomach drop for half a second before she heard Dacre's voice from the shadow beside the building wall. Left side, don't shoot us. She let out a breath. The group was still there. All 11 of them, pressed against the north wall in the dark, in the cold February that Dunmore, Wyoming produced without apology. Dacre in the wheelchair with the rigid posture of a man conducting himself at attention, regardless of circumstances. Dwyer, beside him. Ferris, the concussed lieutenant who shouldn't have been vertical, sitting on the ground against the wall with his head between his knees in a way that suggested his body had filed a successful motion. The others clustered in the cold without complaint, because these were people who had spent time in conditions that made this look manageable. Paloma appeared from the far end of the lane. She must have come down the external maintenance stairwell after the blackout, the same route she'd have taken when she realized the interior was no longer viable. Hobbs? Mara asked immediately. Paloma's face did something complicated. He's inside. He wouldn't come out. His leg, when the blackout hit, he said he couldn't make the stairwell fast enough without noise, so he went back to the supply room. She paused. He said to tell you he's fine and you should focus. Mara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. He's not fine, she said. No, Paloma agreed. Probably not. She looked at the group in the lane, ran the numbers she'd been running since Cade had given her the personnel count. 7 minutes, roughly, until Kestrel Actual's ETA. The external team would come in with force and information, but without interior layout knowledge, and without knowing where Vreth's people were positioned, which meant the first 3 to 4 minutes of their arrival would be a high-confusion clearing operation. In a building with 42 patients, some of them immobile, some of them on the first floor east, some of them still in the interior with an armed team whose objective had shifted to something she still didn't fully understand, she looked at Dacre. Inside personnel count from your observation when you were mobile. Any additions I wouldn't know about? Dacre thought. I counted a maintenance contractor near the generator room 2 days ago. Wasn't one of ours. Halverson. Prepositioned. She'd known it and said nothing. She filed that separately. Also, Dacre said, the administrative wing on the first floor has 4 staff members who were in a meeting when this started. Nobody's come out. I don't know if they're secured or hiding. 4 more people in the administrative wing, potentially unaccounted for by Vreth's team, potentially in the path of whatever was about to happen when the external response came in hard and fast with incomplete information. She made the decision before she'd finished the calculation, which was usually how the decisions that mattered got made. Paloma, you have the group. Do not let anyone re-enter the building. If the external team makes contact before I'm back, tell them 8 personnel inside. Original objective was Reyes room 211. Objective has shifted. Priority target is now the secondary complication they don't know about. She looked at Paloma directly. Can you say that back? Paloma said it back, word for word, with the particular focus of someone who has chosen, in the last 45 minutes, to be more than they thought they were. One more thing, Mara said. If you see a man named Hobbs come out of the north utility exit, sit him down and don't let him go anywhere else, regardless of what he says. Got it. She went back in. The administrative wing was off the first floor main corridor, west of the junction where the 2 guards were still stationed for their outdated purpose. She came at it from the south fire door, accessible from the mechanical basement corridor she'd already used, and came up inside the administrative section itself, which meant she'd bypassed the guards entirely. The 4 staff members were in the second conference room, door locked from the inside. She knocked twice, paused, knocked 3 times. Nothing. She said quietly through the door, I'm medical staff. 3rd floor. I need you to stay in this room until I come back. And when I do, I'll say maintenance before I knock. If you don't hear that word, don't open the door. A long pause. Then a woman's voice, very quiet. Are there still people with guns out there? Yes, but the cavalry is about 6 minutes out. Stay put. She moved on. The 2nd floor. This was the problem she'd been walking around the edges of since Cade had told her the shift in objective. Vreth had 2 people holding Reyes in room 211. If Vreth's priority had changed, if he was no longer focused on extracting authentication from Reyes and was instead focused on locating her, then Reyes was potentially no longer useful to him. And a captive who was no longer useful to a professional operational team in a deteriorating situation was a variable they might choose to eliminate before the external response arrived. She was in the north stairwell before she'd finished the thought. 2nd floor. The lights were still out. The red emergency strip guided her to the top of the stairwell, and she stopped at the door and listened. Movement inside the corridor. 1 set of footsteps. Irregular. Someone moving between positions rather than maintaining station. That suggested the 2-person team in the corridor had become one, which meant either the second had moved to a different position or Vreth had pulled someone. She went through the door low and moved right, pressing to the wall. In the faint emergency strip light, she could see the door to room 211 was closed. 1 man standing outside it, far enough down the corridor that she had about 20 feet of visual distance. He hadn't seen her yet. She also saw something else. Room 214, Reyes's original room, the one Dwyer had given her as the assignment, had its door ajar. In the narrow crack of the opening, there was light. Not emergency strip. A contained light, the kind a device screen made. She moved toward 214 instead of 211, slow, against the wall. The guard outside 211 was looking the other direction, toward the south stairwell, the direction a response would logically come from. She reached 214 and put her fingers on the door and pushed it open a half-inch more. Vreth was inside, alone. Seated at the small desk that all patient rooms had against the wall, with a tablet device open in front of him, speaking quietly into an earpiece. Whatever he was transmitting or receiving, he was focused entirely on it. The posture of a man in a critical communication window, the kind you did not interrupt and did not expect to be interrupted during. On the tablet screen, she could see a document. She couldn't read it from the door angle. She could, however, read the header. 3 words. A classification marker followed by 2 words she recognized from a world she'd left. A world she'd specifically and deliberately left, with both hands and significant effort. And the sight of those 2 words in that configuration, on a tablet screen in the hands of a man who had just reprioritized his entire operational objective to finding her, told her something that rearranged the architecture of everything she thought this situation was. This wasn't about Reyes's authentication codes. Reyes was the cover. She'd been the objective from the beginning. She was still processing that when the floor below them detonated. Not a full explosive, a shaped breach charge, the kind used to blow a specific entry point rather than bring down a structure. It came through the east stairwell with a sound like a thunderclap confined to one room, shaking the walls and sending the corridor's emergency strip flickering for 3 full seconds. Kestrel actual, arriving with significantly less than 14 minutes on the clock. The guard in the corridor spun toward the sound. Vreth came off the chair, and Mara came through the door of room 214 with the sidearm up. Vreth moved fast, faster than she'd expected from a man his size, which she should have expected because she'd underestimated it, and the half-second of that underestimation gave him enough space to bring his weapon up before she could close the distance. They hit the collision point somewhere in the middle of the room. Her gun hand met his elbow met her shoulder, the tablet went off the desk and cracked on the floor. And then they were at the kind of close quarters where calibrated technique became a secondary consideration to raw mechanical leverage. She was smaller. She used it the way she'd been taught to use it, which was differently than most people expected. His gun went wide, discharged once into the ceiling, a sound that would tell Kestrel's team exactly which room on the second floor needed immediate attention. She got inside his arm and turned the mechanical advantage, and for about 4 seconds she thought she had it. Then his free hand found her wrist, and he had 80 pounds on her, and he used it. She went into the wall. The impact was shoulder and skull, the wall being the unforgiving drywall over concrete variety that military medical facilities were constructed from. Her vision went white at the edges for exactly 1 second. Not out, not even close, but the second of white was real, and in that second Vreth had created the distance between them that he needed. He had the gun on her. She had the gun on him. The distance between them was 6 feet, which was too close to miss from either direction. From below, she could hear the Kestrel team moving through the first floor. Controlled, rapid, the organized clatter of a breach and clear that knew what it was doing. From the corridor, she could hear the guard reacting to the breach sound in someone else's voice, authoritative and military, telling him in terms that required no interpretation to put the weapon down. Seconds. Maybe 30 of them before the second floor was reached. Vreth looked at her over the barrel of his weapon. His breathing was controlled. So was hers, more or less. "You knew," he said. "Before tonight. You knew we were coming." "No," she said. "Honest, because there wasn't a reason not to be. I noticed things. I didn't know what they meant until I did." "The contractor, the patrol pattern." "Yes." "And you stayed anyway." She looked at him. "I work here." Something moved in his expression that she couldn't entirely classify. Not respect, exactly. Something in the neighborhood of it, the way a calculation looked when it arrived at an answer that wasn't the one it expected. "Who sent you?" he said. "To this facility, specifically." "I requested the transfer myself." "That's what the paperwork says. I've read the paperwork." He kept the weapon steady. "Paperwork is written by people." The footsteps on the stairwell were getting louder. 30 seconds had become 20. "The call sign you sent," Vreth said. "It's registered to a program that was officially terminated 4 years ago. The operator attached to it was listed as discharged, medical, bilateral soft tissue, and one incident that doesn't appear in any file I've seen that's unclassified." He looked at her with an expression that had stopped being tactical and become something else entirely. "You didn't retire. They retired you. And then someone unretired you and put you here and didn't tell you why." The door to room 214 came open hard. 3 members of the Kestrel team in full tactical gear came through in a stack, weapons up, swept the room in the standard 2-second pattern, and found 2 people pointing weapons at each other across 6 feet of broken space. The team leader, a woman, mid-30s, moving with the unhurried precision of someone who had cleared many rooms, looked at the scene and said, in a voice that expected compliance, "Both weapons down, now." Mara lowered hers immediately. Vreth held for 1 more second, then lowered his. The team leader looked at Mara, then looked at her again, in a way that had a specific quality. The way people looked when a face matched something they'd been briefed on, but didn't expect to find in these exact circumstances. She said, "Voss?" Mara said nothing. The team leader touched her earpiece, said something into it that Mara couldn't catch, then looked back at Mara with an expression that had moved from operational to something considerably harder to name. "Colonel Harwick wants to speak with you," she said, immediately. The name hit Mara like the wall had, without the physical component, just the impact of it, the internal kind, the kind that landed in the place where you kept things you'd decided were behind you. Harwick. She hadn't heard that name in 3 years. She'd specifically arranged her life so that she wouldn't hear that name, or any name connected to the work that name represented. She'd filled out the paperwork and driven the dented truck and requested the remote posting and spent 2 weeks letting people call her a rookie and said nothing because nothing was the version of her life she'd chosen. Vreth, being zip-tied by the second Kestrel team member, was watching her face. "Now you know," he said quietly. Not crowing, just observing. "You weren't placed here by accident." She looked at him, then at the team leader, who was waiting with the particular patience of someone carrying an order they intend to see through regardless of the response. From below, the building was being cleared room by room. She could hear the specific cadence of it, a professional team moving through a space with methodical speed, the calls going room to room like a receding wave. She could also hear, faintly, from somewhere on the first floor, a familiar voice arguing at volume with someone who was presumably trying to give him medical attention, about a leg he didn't want looked at, and a nurse he was trying to locate. Dacre. Somehow inside the building, somehow upright. In different circumstances, she might have found it funny. The team leader said again, "Colonel Harwick, he's on the line right now." Mara looked at the cracked tablet on the floor. The document that had been open on Vreth's screen was face down. But the header she'd seen, those 3 words, that classification marker followed by the 2 she recognized, was still visible in her mind with the clarity of things that land hard. Her name had been on that document, not Voss. The other one, the one attached to the call sign, the one that belonged to the 11 years she'd shut the door on. She looked at the team leader and said, "Tell Harwick I need 5 minutes." The team leader blinked. Clearly that was not a response that Harwick received often. He said immediately, "Ma'am." "I heard you." She moved toward the door. "I have a patient with a fractured femur who shouldn't have walked 2 flights of stairs, a concussed lieutenant who's been vertical for 45 minutes, and 4 administrative staff locked in a conference room on the first floor who are waiting for me to knock and say the word maintenance." She paused at the door. "Tell Harwick 5 minutes." She went into the corridor without waiting for the answer. The corridor smelled like wet concrete and spent adrenaline, which was a combination Mara associated with the aftermath of things she'd rather not have lived through. She moved toward the stairwell with the team leader whose name she still didn't have, following at a distance that was close enough to be an escort and far enough to pretend it wasn't. The building was being cleared floor by floor with the mechanical efficiency of people who did this for a living and had stopped finding it interesting. She could hear the calls going room to room below her, the short confirmations, the occasional instruction in a clipped voice that carried through walls the way military voices always did. Not loud, just projected with the specific intention of being heard through obstruction. She found Dacre in the first-floor main corridor, sitting in his wheelchair with the expression of a man who had been arguing with someone and won on points, but lost on outcome. A Kestrel medic was crouched beside him, examining his hip with the professional focus of someone who had immediately identified the problem and was calculating how to phrase it. Dacre was letting the examination happen with visible impatience. He looked up when she came into the corridor, looked her over. The shoulder she was carrying slightly wrong, the cut above her hairline from the wall impact that she'd been ignoring, and said, "You look terrible. You walked 2 flights of stairs on a post-surgical hip. I was helping. You were—" She stopped, decided that was not the fight worth having. "How bad is it?" "Not as bad as it was before I got up." He said it with the air of someone who knew this was medically incorrect and didn't care. The medic beside him made a sound that wasn't words but communicated an entire clinical opinion. "Who are these people?" Dacre added, gesturing at the tactical gear around them. "Kestrel unit. External response." "They're good." "Yes. Better than what I'd expect on 14 minutes notice for a facility like this." She looked at him. He was saying something specific with that, framed as an observation, and she understood what he was saying and didn't answer it, which was its own kind of answer. Dacre's eyes moved over her face with the unhurried read of a man who had spent 30 years learning to take the full picture of a situation and was currently taking it. He said quietly enough that the medic wouldn't catch it over the ambient noise. "Were they coming for you?" She held his gaze for a second. Then she said, "I don't know yet." It was true. Partially. She left him with the medic and moved toward the administrative wing. The knock sequence, 2, then 3, produced no response at the conference room door. She said maintenance clearly through it. A pause, long enough that she began calculating whether she needed to consider alternative access. Then the lock turned and the door opened and 4 people looked at her from the inside of a conference room that smelled like they'd been breathing recycled air and controlled fear for the past 45 minutes. 3 women, 1 man, administrative staff, various ages, the particular look of people who had spent time in a genuine emergency without the training that made emergencies more manageable. The youngest of the women, early 20s, a file clerk by the lanyard she still had around her neck, had clearly been crying and had stopped being embarrassed about it approximately 30 minutes ago. "Are they gone?" the man asked. "The building's being cleared. You need to come with me to the North Service exit. There's medical staff outside." "Is everyone—" the older woman started. "I don't have a full picture yet. Move now. Questions outside." They moved. She got them to the north exit through the service lane and handed them to Paloma, who had apparently organized the outdoor group into something resembling a triage setup using the contents of a supply cabinet that Dwyer, acting on some combination of initiative and the need to do something with his hands that didn't involve his still-fixed arms, had dragged outside on a cart. Paloma looked at Mara the way she'd been looking at her since the second floor, which was with the expression of someone who had added up a long column of numbers and arrived at a total they were still absorbing. "Hobbs?" Mara asked. "Inside somewhere. I haven't been able to reach him." She went back in. She found him in the East Wing supply room, where he'd said he'd be. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the shelving unit, leg extended, the fire extinguisher between his knees like a battle standard he wasn't ready to set down. His face had the gray-white color of someone whose pain management had run out some time ago and who had been managing by conversational relationship with his own stubbornness. He looked up when she came in. She sat down on the floor across from him without ceremony, which seemed to be what the moment called for. "How long?" she asked. "Since the third stairwell step, going up." He looked at the leg with the detached assessment of someone taking inventory. It held, that's what matters. "It doesn't hold for nothing. You'll be back in surgery." "Probably." He said it with the equanimity of a man who had already performed this math and filed it under acceptable. Then he looked at her directly, the way he'd been looking at her since the gun in the East Wing corridor, the look that had replaced the one that had called her a rookie. "I want to ask you something." "All right." Not about what I saw tonight." He stopped, started again with more care. "All those days, when I was giving you a hard time, Dwyer and me." He paused. "You knew, the whole time, what you were, what you could do." "Yes." "And I just worked," she said. "That was the point." He was quiet for a moment. The supply room smelled like antiseptic and cardboard, and the particular stillness of a space that had been completely alone for the last hour. From somewhere in the building, she could hear the ongoing systematic sounds of the Kestrel team finishing their sweep. "I called you a rookie," Hobbs said. "You did. 37 times, give or take." She looked at him. "I wasn't counting." "I was." He said it without looking away. "It wasn't right. I want you to know that I know that." She held the look for a second. There were things she could say to that, gracious things, dismissive things, the range of responses that people offered when someone said a real thing and you had to decide how to receive it. She said, "You carried a fire extinguisher up 2 flights on a broken leg and took out an armed operative in a blacked-out corridor. I think we're settled." He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, a short, involuntary thing that cost him something around the hip and that he absorbed without stopping. "Yeah, okay. Maybe." She stood up, reached down. He took the hand and she helped him up with appropriate attention to the leg, and he leaned on the shelving unit and looked at her one more time. "Whoever Harwick is," he said, "he can wait 5 more minutes." She hadn't said that name within earshot of Hobbs. She was certain of it. He saw her face register that and said, "I was in the corridor outside 214 for about 30 seconds before the Kestrel team came in. Sound carries." She looked at him. "I've heard of Harwick," he said, and his voice had changed, gone from the careful register of the apology to something older and more specific, the register of a man who had been many places and paid attention in them. Not by reputation, by something a guy in my unit said once, in Kandahar, about a program that operated off the books and didn't leave paperwork, and when it ended, nobody who'd been part of it ended up where they said they were supposed to end up. The supply room was very quiet. "If your name is connected to that," Hobbs said, "then tonight wasn't random, Voss." "I know." "And whoever put you here—" "I know," she said again. "I'm working on it." She helped him to the door and into the corridor and handed him off to a Kestrel medic, who appeared from around the corner with the timing of someone who'd been monitoring the building's occupied spaces. Then she stood in the East Wing corridor for a moment by herself, because she needed one moment to exist without anyone in it. Harwick had put her here. She didn't have confirmation of that. She had Vreth's statement, which was the statement of a man with operational interest in her doubt. She had a document header she'd read at an angle in bad light for less than 2 seconds. And she had the fact that the Kestrel team had arrived 7 minutes faster than physically possible from any response station listed in Harlow Medical's emergency protocol network, which meant they hadn't been activated by her emergency alert. They'd been positioned, close, pre-positioned, waiting. She walked toward the main stairwell. The team leader was at the top of the stairs, earpiece in, tablet in hand, managing the ongoing sweep with the measured attention of someone used to running several things at once. When she saw Mara coming, she said into the earpiece, "Hold one," and pulled it out. "Colonel Harwick," she said. "In a minute." Mara looked at her. "What's your name?" A pause. "Captain Della Varro." "Varro? Where were you staged before this?" Varro looked at her with a careful expression. "I'm not approximate distance. I'm not asking for the grid reference. I'm asking whether you were close enough that my alert shouldn't have been your activation." Varro was quiet for 2 seconds. Then, "We were activated before your alert." There it was. "How long before?" 40 minutes. Varro said it without inflection, the way people delivered information they'd been carrying uncomfortably and were relieved to put down. "We received a staging order 40 minutes before your beacon went through." 40 minutes before the beacon, before the blackout, before the explosion in the East Corridor, before any of it was visibly happening. Someone had known the timeline of this operation from the outside and had staged a response team, and had done it in a way that ensured the response team would arrive in time to find Mara in the building, in the situation, undeniable, documented. She thought about the contractor's truck in the parking lot, the irregular patrol, the electrical work near the generator room. She'd noticed all of it. She'd noticed and said nothing and stayed, because staying had felt like the right choice for reasons she hadn't interrogated closely enough. And the question was whether she'd stayed because she'd chosen to, or because staying was what someone who knew how she thought had arranged for her to do. She said, "Take me to Harwick." Varro led her to the second-floor administrative office that the Kestrel team had set up as a temporary command space, a nondescript room with a folding table, a satellite communications unit, and a screen that was currently running a secure video link with a face she recognized. Harwick was 61 years old, and he looked it. And he looked like a man who had built a career on looking like something other than what he was. The face on the screen was a grandfather's face, broad, unremarkable, the kind that moved through airports without attention. The eyes behind it were not a grandfather's eyes. He looked at her and said without preamble, "You did well." "Don't," she said. He accepted that. "All right. You knew about the operation." "We had intelligence suggesting Vreth's network was going to make a move against a specific facility within a 60-day window. We didn't know which facility until Vreth's contractor arrived in Dunmore. And then you put me here. We accelerated your transfer request." His voice was level. Not apologetic, not defensive. The voice of someone explaining a decision they stood behind and knew she'd object to. "You'd already submitted it. We redirected it. To put me in a building that was about to be hit. To put someone in that building who could handle what was going to happen when it was hit." He looked at her steadily. "We couldn't send an active team in without alerting Vreth's network. They had eyes inside the facility. Halverson, and at least one other we've been tracking. An active team would have burned the operation before it started. So you sent me, without telling me. We sent the best person we had for what we needed, using an arrangement that was already in motion." He paused. "You weren't in danger we didn't calculate." She looked at him through the screen and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite something else. A complicated response to a situation she didn't have clean feelings about, which was the honest description and the one she was sticking to. "What's on Vreth's tablet?" she said. "The document. My name is on it." A pause. "Yes." "He said I was the objective from the beginning, not Reyes." "Reyes was the mechanism," Harwick said. "Vreth's network has been trying to access a specific intelligence package for 18 months. Reyes controls the authentication for that package, But the package itself is accessible only through an operator whose clearance was flagged as inactive. Someone whose access should have been closed when they were discharged. He looked at her. It wasn't closed. The supply room. The crawl space. The 14 minutes on the clock. The call sign that had gone through a blackout because someone hadn't closed the distribution channel gap. The call sign that was attached to access that should have been revoked 3 years ago and hadn't been. She said, "You left my clearance active. We left it accessible, specifically, in a way that would show as a vulnerability to anyone looking for a back door into the package." A lure. A lure, he confirmed. Vareth came looking for someone whose access could get him into the package. He found your call sign in the system and built his operation around it. He looked at her without expression. We needed him to do exactly that. The room was quiet, except for the ambient noise of the Kestrel team doing their work, the distant sounds of a building being systematically accounted for. Mara stood in front of the screen and processed what she was processing. "The document on his tablet," she said, "the one with my name, contains the access sequence he needed from you, specifically designed to look real enough to commit resources to." Harwick looked at her. "He needed you alive and cooperative. That's why the shift in objective. He wasn't trying to kill you." He pointed a weapon at me. "Yes, he's a professional. He wasn't going to execute you. He was going to negotiate. We assessed a 92% likelihood that—" "Don't," she said again. He stopped. She looked at the screen for a moment. Looked at the face that had been making 92% assessments about situations she was inside of while she was inside of them. "Vreth said something to me," she said. "He said I wasn't placed here by accident, and I told him I didn't know that yet." She looked at Harwick. "I was wrong about that." "Yes." "And the Halverson contractor, the second pre-positioned source you mentioned, you knew about both of them. We identified them 6 weeks ago. But you didn't pull them. You didn't warn the facility. Pulling them would have told Vreth's network that we were inside the operation. We needed them to run their setup to completion." She thought about the 42 patients in this building, the 4 administrative staff in the conference room, someone who'd been present during rounds, during supply deliveries, during the ordinary operating life of a medical facility that had no idea it was a stage set for an intelligence operation. "Who was the second source?" she said. Harwick said, "One of the security contractors. Night rotation." Fulton. The patrol rotation that had been running irregular and consistent and wrong. She had noticed Fulton's pattern on the 3rd day. She had filed it and said nothing because saying something would have required explaining how she knew to notice, and she'd been protecting the thing she came here to protect, which was her own invisibility. And someone had known she'd notice and say nothing because they knew how she worked. She said, "You used me because I see things and don't report them." Harwick was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "We used you because you're the only person we had who could walk into that building, identify what was wrong, and manage the situation when it detonated, without any of the people inside knowing why you could do those things." "That's a cleaner version of what I said." "It's the accurate version," he said. "What you said is also accurate." She stood in front of the screen and did not say anything for a moment. Outside the room, from somewhere on the 1st floor, she could hear Docker's voice. Not the words, just the cadence. The particular authoritative register of a man who had decided to have an opinion about his own medical care and was expressing it to whoever was trying to provide it. Some things were consistent. "I want to see the full document from the tablet," she said. "We'll debrief now. I want to see it now." She looked at Harwick directly. "You put me in this building without telling me why. You used my clearance as a lure without telling me it was still active. You staged a response team that arrived looking for me specifically, which means my face and my name and my call sign are now in the documentation for an operation that I did not consent to be part of." She kept her voice level. "I want to see the document." A pause. Longer than the others. Then Harwick looked at someone off screen and said, "Send it to Vero's tablet." Vero's tablet chimed. She held it out to Mara without being asked. Mara looked at the document. It was 43 pages. The header she'd read in bad light at an angle had been accurate. Her clearance designation, followed by her operational call sign, followed by the program name she hadn't seen written down in 3 years. The program that Harwick had told her was terminated. The program that Hobbs's contact in Kandahar had mentioned as something that didn't leave paperwork. The document was dated 14 months ago. It was not a lure. It was not a fabricated access sequence designed to draw Vreth's network in. It was an active program brief. Her name at the top. Her clearance level. Her current assignment, Harlow Military Medical Center, Dunmore, Wyoming. Listed not as a redirect of her transfer request, but as a placement. A placement made 14 months before she'd submitted any request to go anywhere. She had not requested the transfer. The transfer had been arranged, and then she'd been guided to request it by a process she suddenly understood with a precision that felt like cold water. The conversation with her supervisor in Denver, the form she'd been handed that listed the available postings, the way Dunmore had been third on the list, but the first two had had administrative notes attached that made them seem less immediately available. Small architectural choices, the kind that looked like options and weren't. She had driven the dented truck to Dunmore, Wyoming because she'd chosen to. She had not chosen to. She looked up from the tablet. Harwick was watching her face read the document with the expression of a man who had made a decision he believed in and was now waiting to see what it cost. She said, "How long?" He didn't ask how long what. The current operational phase? 14 months. The broader program. He paused. "You've been in it since the beginning, Mara. You were never out." The room was entirely quiet. Varro was looking at the floor. Mara stood with the tablet and the 43 pages, and the particular interior experience of discovering that the life you'd believed you'd built for yourself had been built around you by someone else, who'd anticipated every exit and left them open just wide enough to feel like choices. She had filed paperwork, she had signed forms, she had driven the truck. She said, "Was any of it mine?" Harwick looked at her, and for the first time in the conversation, something in his face moved. Not sentiment, not apology, but something in the category of human acknowledgement, the kind that recognized a weight it had put on someone without being willing to take it back. "The nursing," he said, "that was yours. We didn't build that." He paused. "Everything you did in that building tonight, that was yours. We gave you the placement. What you did with it, how you saw it, how you ran it, we didn't engineer that. We couldn't." She looked at the tablet, at her name at the top of 43 pages of a life that had been partially constructed around her, at the call sign that had never been retired, sitting active in a system that had kept it live for reasons she'd thought she understood and hadn't. From outside the room, a Kestrel team member knocked twice and opened the door a precise 3 inches. "Captain Varro, we have a situation on the north perimeter." Varro looked at Mara with an expression that asked a question she didn't put into words. Mara said, "What situation?" The team member looked between them. "We had 8 personnel accounted for inside the building. The count on the perimeter now shows 9 people in custody." 9. Vreth's count had been 8. She'd built the entire operational picture on 8, and she'd gotten it from Cade, who'd given her the number without visible hesitation, in a utility corridor, after she'd let him go with an empty weapon and a gauze pad for his head. Cade, who had been 25 and looked like he'd been doing this since he was 18, and had given her information she hadn't verified against any independent source because she'd been running on compressed time and the number had fit her operational model, so she'd used it. 9. There was someone else in this building, someone who hadn't been in any room she'd cleared, someone whose position she didn't have, someone who had been inside Harlow Military Medical Center during the entire operation, moving in the spaces between every head count she'd run, and who had just been taken on the north perimeter going out with something. She looked at Varro. "What were they carrying?" she said. Varro touched her earpiece, asked, listened. The answer, when she repeated it, was 4 words. A medical personnel file. Mara's file. Her actual personnel file, not the nursing record, not the transfer paperwork. The file that would have been in the facility administrator's office in the East Administrative Wing, in a cabinet she'd walked past every time she went to the supply distribution room. The file that, in a military medical facility, contained not just employment records but security clearance documentation, assignment history, and the intake medical evaluation that every staff member received on arrival. An evaluation that, in her case, had been conducted by a physician who had access to her full history, the history that predated Mara Voss transfer nurse, the history that was supposed to be sealed. Not a lure, not a fabricated document. Someone had come for the real thing, and they'd almost gotten out with it. She was out the door before Varro finished the sentence. The north perimeter was 140 feet from the administrative building entrance, across the service lane, and the narrow access road that ran between the facility's main structure and the generator annex. She covered it in under a minute, moving through the cold February dark with the particular efficiency of a body that had been running on stress chemicals for over an hour and had found some kind of second floor beneath the adrenaline where things simply got done. 2 Kestrel team members had a person face down on the frozen ground beside the perimeter fence, wrists already secured. The medical personnel file, a standard military facility folder, olive green, approximately half an inch thick, was sitting in a clear evidence bag on the hood of a parked vehicle 6 feet away. Mara looked at the person on the ground. The face, turned sideways against the frozen dirt, was Dr. Emmett Bryce. She stood very still for a moment. Bryce, who had told her he'd review Wren's cultures after lunch and then ordered them 40 minutes later. Bryce, who had been in the break room at sandwich hour, who had moved through this facility's daily operations with the unremarkable presence of a man who had been there long enough that nobody looked at him directly anymore. Bryce, who had access to the administrator's office, to the medical personnel files, to the intake evaluations that every staff member received on arrival. Bryce, who had conducted her intake evaluation on day 1. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ground, jaw set, with the expression of a man who had already made his calculations and found them coming up short, and was now waiting for whatever came next with the particular stillness of someone who had stopped having options. She looked at the evidence bag, at the folder inside it. How far did he get? She asked the nearest Kestrel member. Perimeter fence. He had a vehicle staged on the access road. Staged. Not a panicked grab. A planned exit, timed to the confusion of the breach and the sweep. Bryce had known the timeline of tonight's operation. Not because he was part of Vreth's team, she looked at him and ran the picture and didn't think that was it. Because someone had told him to be ready to move when the building became accessible to unauthorized personnel and to collect one specific item when it did. A different chain. A different set of people using the same event for a different purpose. She crouched down to eye level with Bryce. He looked at her. His expression moved through something she didn't have a clean label for. Not guilt, not defiance, something more complicated and human than either. The look of a man who had told himself a story about what he was doing and was watching that story come apart at a seam he hadn't properly reinforced. "Who asked you to get the file?" she said. He said nothing. "Emmett." She used his first name without planning to, and something in his face shifted at it. "You ordered the right cultures for Wren. You didn't have to do that." She looked at him steadily. "There's still a version of tonight where what you did is the thing that matters most. But that window is small and it is closing." He was quiet for another second. Then, to the ground. "I was told it was a personnel audit, that there were irregularities in the intake documentation for a staff member, and the file needed to be reviewed off-site." "By whom?" A pause. "A man named Grayling said he was from Federal Personnel Compliance." She looked at the Kestrel member. "Did you get that?" "Got it." She stood up. Grayling was a name she didn't recognize, which meant a third chain, a third set of interests operating around the same event with different objectives. Vreth's network wanting her access credentials. Someone using Vreth's operation as cover to move her physical file. And Harwick's people, who had known enough about the first 2 to stage a response but apparently hadn't known about the third. She went back inside. Harwick was still on the screen when she came back into the command room. Varro had been updating him. His expression when Mara walked in had already incorporated the information about Bryce in the file. She didn't sit down. "Grayling," she said. Harwick's jaw tightened fractionally. "We're running it. You didn't know." "No." "So there's a third party who knew enough about tonight's operation to stage an asset inside this facility and use the breach window to extract my physical file. And your intelligence package on Vreth's network didn't surface that." "No," he said again. It clearly cost him something to say it twice. She looked at him. "The file from my intake evaluation. What's in it that a third party would want badly enough to preposition someone for months?" Harwick was quiet for long enough that she knew the answer was real before he gave it. Your intake evaluation included a full medical and psychological history conducted under the intake protocol. That history references your operational assignments from your active service period. He looked at her. Including one assignment that has never appeared in any formal documentation and that 3 people besides yourself know the details of. She looked at him for a long moment. Aldrin Pass, she said. The name landed in the room like something physical. Vero's posture changed by a degree that she'd have to have been watching to catch. Harwick said, yes. Aldrin Pass was not in any file she had ever seen with her own name attached to it, because she had been told, explicitly and in person, by 2 people she'd trusted within the structure she'd been part of, that the events of Aldrin Pass had been formally unrecorded at the highest classification level and would remain that way. It was the assignment that had ended her active operational career, not with a ceremony or a citation, but with a medical discharge and a carefully maintained silence. The intake evaluation had been conducted by Bryce, who had used a standardized military medical form that, buried in its psychological history section on page 7, had a field for significant service incidents. She had answered honestly. She had been told to be honest by the protocol. She had not known that Bryce's evaluation went anywhere beyond the standard facility file. She had not known the file was accessible. She had not known, apparently, a considerable number of things. She said, "Who is Grayling working for?" "We'll know within the hour." "That's not what I asked." Harwick looked at her steadily. "The most likely candidate is a private intelligence contractor that has been attempting to reconstruct the Aldrin Pass record for approximately 2 years. They have clients in 3 countries with interest in the operational details of that event." He paused. "We believe they've been using Vreth's network operations as intelligence gathering opportunities, following his work, not directing it, and harvesting whatever surfaces." She processed this. "So Vreth didn't know about Grayling?" "Almost certainly not." "And Grayling didn't know about your staging operation?" "No, and I didn't know about any of it." Harwick said nothing to that. There was nothing to say to it. It was simply accurate. She looked at him through the screen, at the grandfather face and the non-grandfather eyes, and the 61 years of decisions made in rooms like this one that had produced, among other things, this particular night in Dunmore, Wyoming. "I want 3 things," she said. "All right. Full disclosure of the Aldrin Pass record, whatever exists. I want to see all of it, including whatever Bryce's evaluation generated." She kept her voice level. "I was part of that operation. I have the right to know what's been written about it." "That's 1. Grayling and whoever he's working for, I want to know the outcome, not a summary. The actual legal outcome with documentation. I'll give you a contact address. 2. The people in this building tonight, the staff, the patients, Paloma, Hobbs, they don't get managed. They don't get visits from quiet men in civilian clothes suggesting they experience things differently than they did. Whatever happened here tonight happened, and the people who were in it get to keep what they know about it." Harwick looked at her for a moment. "That's more than 3 things. The 3rd one is, I resign, formally, from whatever I'm apparently still part of, regardless of what I was told 3 years ago. I want paperwork that confirms it, and I want the clearance actually closed this time, not left active as a mechanism for an operation I don't consent to." She held his gaze. "I'll sign whatever you need me to sign, but I'm done." The room was quiet. Vera was looking at the middle distance with the careful focus of someone filing away a conversation they would think about for a long time. Harwick said, "Is there anything I can say?" "About Aldrin Pass or about tonight?" "Either." She thought about it honestly. "No." And then, because it was true and she had learned a long time ago that accurate things were worth saying even when they were inconvenient, "You put the right person in this building. I understand why you made the call you made. I'm not telling you that you were wrong about the outcome." She looked at him. "I'm telling you that the outcome being right doesn't make the method acceptable, and I'm not willing to be a mechanism again, even a willing one, without knowing what I'm part of." Harwick was quiet for a moment. Then, "Fair." Just that. Fair. It was more honest than she'd expected. She said, "Do we have an agreement?" "We have an agreement." She looked at him for one last second, then she turned and walked out of the room and didn't look back at the screen. The hallway outside smelled like fire suppression residue and cold air coming through a breach in the east wall, and she stood in it for a moment doing nothing at all. just breathing, just being a person in a corridor who had just said the things she needed to say and meant it. Down the hall, the Kestrel sweep was winding toward completion. The last clear came through on Vero's radio. All floors, all rooms, all personnel accounted for. The building was secure. The building was, technically and operationally, over. Everything else was just beginning. She went to find her patients. The outdoor triage that Paloma and Dwyer had assembled in the service lane had been absorbed into the Kestrel team's medical support unit. 2 combat medics who had clearly been surprised by the degree of organized care already in progress and had adapted to it rather than replacing it. Paloma was working beside one of them with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered something about herself in the last 90 minutes and was still in the process of determining what to do with it. She saw Mara, and her face did several things in quick succession. "Ren?" Mara asked immediately. "The Kestrel medics have her. They found her in isolation. Nobody touched her during the operation. She's stable." The relief of that was specific and clean. "The administrative staff?" "All 4. Minor shock. One woman has a hand laceration from the conference room door. Nothing critical." "Ferris?" "Concussion protocol. One of the medics has him." Mara moved through the triage space doing what she'd been doing since the first morning she'd arrived, checking, adjusting, correcting where correction was needed, present in the ordinary specific way that medicine required. A blood pressure reading that needed a second look. An IV line that had run through its bag without anyone noticing. A man with a leg wound he hadn't mentioned because he'd decided it wasn't important, and it wasn't really, but it needed cleaning and he needed to know that someone had noticed it. She noticed it. She was rebandaging the leg wound, a corporal named Estes who kept starting sentences about what had happened and stopping them. When Dacre's wheelchair came alongside her in the service lane, he had clearly discharged himself from the Kestrel medic's care through force of personality, because the medic trailing him a few feet back had the expression of someone who had tried and evaluated their options and accepted the outcome. Dacre looked at Estes's leg, then at Mara's hands working, then at her face. "Harwick," he said. She glanced up. "You know him." "Of him, peripherally." He said it with the particular dryness of a man who had been many places and absorbed many things, and had learned to store them without comment until storage was no longer the right response. "The program he ran, whatever tense applies." "Applies past tense as of about 15 minutes ago," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You resigned?" "Yes." "Good," he said. Just that. Not inflected with opinion about her choice. Just the clean agreement of a man who had watched her operate for the past hour and had his own views on what she was worth, and whether those views were compatible with being a mechanism. She finished the bandage, looked up at Dacre. He looked back at her with the same eyes that had spent 2 weeks looking at the ceiling when she walked into his room, except that those eyes were doing something different now, and they both knew it, and neither of them made more of it than it was. "You need to go back in for imaging on that hip," she said. "I know." "You probably re-injured the posterior capsule." "I know that too." "You're going to need a longer recovery timeline than what you had before tonight." "Voss?" He looked at her. "I know. I'll do it." He paused. "You'll be here?" She thought about that for a real second. Dunmore, Wyoming. The dented truck in the parking lot. The third-floor ward with 42 patients and a charge nurse who had handed her a schedule on the first morning without ceremony and expected her to figure the rest out. "For now," she said, and meant it, which surprised her slightly. He nodded once. That was enough. The next hours moved the way aftermath always moved. Not dramatically, but with the grinding, detailed work of accounting for everything that had happened and beginning the process of addressing it. The Kestrel team documented, photographed, collected. Federal agents arrived from Billings at just past 2 in the morning and began the process that federal agents began, which was long and specific and not particularly interesting to watch, but was necessary, and she was glad it was happening. Vireth was taken from the facility in custody with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been in custody before and understood what it meant. He didn't look at Mara as they moved him past the corridor where she was working. Then he did. A single glance, brief, the kind that carried a whole conversation in it without the words. Not hostility, not defeat. Something more complicated, The look of a professional acknowledging another professional across the space of what had just happened between them, with all the attendant ambiguity that carried. She looked back. Then she went back to work. Bryce was taken separately. She watched that one. He walked with the posture of a man who had made a calculation that he now understood had been built on a false premise. Grayling's story about a personnel audit, the legitimacy he'd been sold, the sense that what he was doing was a procedural errand rather than a betrayal. She didn't know how much of that self-assessment was genuine and how much was the version he'd started constructing the moment his face hit the frozen ground. It didn't matter in the practical sense. What mattered was the outcome. Bryce would be questioned extensively. Grayling's name would be run down, and the name behind Grayling, and the clients in 3 countries who'd been reconstructing operational records they had no right to. That chain existed, and it was now visible, and the federal process was real, and she had Harwick's documented agreement and Varro as a witness. She had chosen to believe that was enough. Not because she was certain of it, but because at some point, after a night like this one, you chose the thing you were going to trust in, even imperfectly, and you moved forward. Grayling himself was picked up in a town called Sherrill, 40 miles northeast of Dunmore, at 4:17 in the morning, in a motel he'd apparently been using as a staging point for the 3 weeks he'd spent in the area. The Kestrel team lead sent Varro the confirmation, and Varro passed it to Mara without being asked. Inside the motel room, federal agents found documentation of a surveillance operation that had been running on Harlow Medical for 4 months, schedules, personnel records, a map of the facility with Mara's daily movement patterns marked in pencil, and a burner phone that contained the full communications chain between Grayling and the private contractor he worked for. The contractor was named Solace Meridian Group. It operated out of a registered address in Delaware with actual operations in 2 other countries, and it had 17 clients who had paid for intelligence products over the previous 3 years. By the time the federal case reached charging stage 6 months later, all 17 client relationships would be documented, 11 of them resulting in charges across multiple jurisdictions, and Solace Meridian Group would no longer exist in any operational sense, its principals facing proceedings in 2 countries simultaneously. Mara read the case summary when it arrived at the contact address she'd given Harwick. She read it twice, with coffee, at the kitchen table of the small house she was renting in Dunmore, in the early morning before the shift started. Then she filed it and went to work. The resignation paperwork arrived 3 weeks after the operation. She read every page of it, all 22, which was apparently what formal separation from something that officially didn't exist looked like on paper. She signed where indicated and sent it back through the channel Harwick had provided. The confirmation came 4 days later, a single line stating that her clearance had been formally retired and access removed. No call sign, no active mechanism, just paper, saying what it said. She didn't feel dramatic about it. She felt mostly tired in the good way. The way that came from being done with something you'd been carrying for a long time without realizing how heavy the carrying was. The Aldrin Pass file arrived separately, as Harwick had agreed. 47 pages of operational documentation about an event she'd lived through from the inside and had never been permitted to see from the outside. She read it over 2 evenings. Some of it aligned with what she remembered. Some of it described events she'd been present for in terms that were accurate but flattened. The procedural language of institutional documentation doing what it always did, which was reduce the dimensional weight of things that had happened to people to the size that fit in a report. There was a section about her specifically, her decisions during the operation, her medical interventions under fire, her role in the outcome. The language was formal and precise, and the person it described was someone she recognized but hadn't seen written down before. She closed the file, made tea, sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet of a Dunmore winter morning. Outside, the snow was doing what Wyoming snow did, which was fall steadily and without apology and accumulate until the world looked completely different from how it had looked the day before. She thought about the 47 pages, about what it meant to see yourself documented after the fact, to read a record of who you'd been in a moment that had cost you more than most people would ever be asked to spend, written by people who hadn't been there. The record was accurate. It was also incomplete. It couldn't contain the specific weight of the decisions, the particular texture of operating at the edge of what was possible and discovering that the edge was further out than you thought. That part lived somewhere the documentation couldn't reach. She decided that was fine. That was probably how it was supposed to be. The formal inquiry into the Harlow medical operation was conducted over 6 weeks by a three-person federal review panel. Mara gave testimony on 2 occasions, once in person in Billings, once via secure video. The panel asked specific questions, and she gave specific answers, and the process was not pleasant, but it was real, which was the relevant quality. At the conclusion of the inquiry, the panel produced a report that found no fault in her conduct, documented the pre-positioning of the Kestrel team and the undisclosed nature of her placement, and recommended formal review of the protocols that had allowed the operation to be designed around a non-consenting participant. Harwick's program received that recommendation. What happened to it afterward, she didn't follow. She'd made her agreement, and she'd gotten what she'd asked for, and she trusted the process to the degree that she'd decided to trust it, which was an imperfect degree, and she was at peace with the imperfection. She got a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Reyes 6 weeks after the operation, handwritten, which she hadn't expected. He thanked her for what she'd done on the second floor, for the clarity she'd kept in a situation he'd described, with the unvarnished honesty of a man who had been genuinely frightened as the worst 2 hours of his life. He said he'd read the panel report and understood for the first time the full picture of what had happened and why. He said that didn't make her part of it easier to sit with, and he didn't expect her to find his acknowledgement useful, but he wanted to say it anyway. She wrote back. She said his acknowledgement was useful, and she appreciated the honesty. She said Dunmore was cold but functional, and she was staying for the foreseeable future. She said she hoped his recovery was going well. She meant all of it. Hobbs went back into surgery 6 days after the operation. A scope procedure to address what she'd correctly identified as a re-injury of the posterior capsule, plus a small fracture to the tibial plateau that the imaging had found when they looked. He was in recovery for 4 days and loudly unpleasant about it, and she did 3 of his 4 days of post-operative nursing personally, because the ward was short-staffed and because it seemed appropriate. On the 4th morning, when she came in to do his morning assessment, he was sitting up in bed doing a crossword puzzle with the aggressive focus of a man who had decided to treat his recovery as an enemy he was defeating methodically. He put the puzzle down when she came in. "How many letters incompetent but evasive?" he said. She looked at him. "That's more than one word, Hobbs." "It is," he agreed. He looked at her with the steady, recalibrated gaze that had replaced the one she'd walked into on day 1. "I've been thinking about what I know about what happened." He paused. "And what I'm going to say about it when people ask." She waited. "Nothing," he said. "Not because anyone told me to. Because what happened here is yours, and I don't think I get to turn it into a story I tell at bars." He looked at the crossword. "I just wanted you to know that." She stood at the foot of his bed for a moment. She said, "Thank you, Garrett." It was the first time she'd used his given name. He registered it without making anything of it, which was the right response, and she appreciated it. Dwyer was discharged on the 3rd week with both arms still in fixation, but mobile enough to be released to outpatient care, and he came to find her before he left. Something she hadn't expected from him, given that their entire acquaintance had been built on him doing things she hadn't expected. He was a slight young man without the external armor that the others wore, and he stood in the corridor outside the supply room with his fixed arms at his sides and said, without apparent embarrassment, "When I'm back on my feet, I want to do what you do." "Nursing?" she said. "Not just all of it, the whole thing." He looked at her directly. "I've been in places. Not like you, I know that. But I've been in them, and I've never seen anyone run a situation the way you ran that one." He paused. "I want to know how to do that." She looked at him for a moment, thought about what she could say that was honest without being larger than the moment required. "It's not a skill," she said. "It's more like you notice things for long enough and you stop being surprised when they matter, and you learn to work with what's actually in front of you instead of what you planned for." She paused. "The medical part, though, the nursing, that's a skill. That one you can learn." He nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd been thinking. "One more thing," he said. "Dwyer." "Yeah?" "The first week, when we called you a rookie." He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "We were idiots." "Yes," she agreed without cruelty. "But you were the kind of idiot that carries a man with fixed arms across a service lane in the dark, so I think you'll manage." He almost smiled. "Take care of yourself, ma'am." "You too, Corporal." He left. She watched him go and felt something she didn't put a name to, the particular texture of watching a person move toward becoming who they were going to be. Paloma didn't go anywhere. That was the simplest part, and in some ways the most significant. She stayed, the way people stayed when they had found something in a situation they were going to need to understand better. She changed, the way people changed when they discovered that the person they'd been before a night like that one was not the final version. She started asking different questions during rounds, more specific, more clinical, the questions that came from someone who had noticed that noticing things mattered and had decided to get better at it. She asked Mara, about 2 months after the operation, during a night shift break at 1 in the morning with both of them on coffee, "What do you want now that all of it is done?" Mara thought about that. Outside the break room window, the Dunmore winter had begun its retreat towards something reluctantly resembling spring. The parking lot was empty. No contractor's truck. No irregular patrol. Just the ordinary nighttime of an ordinary medical facility doing what medical facilities did, which was stay open and stay ready and not ask too much of the night. "I want to do this," she said. "The work. What I've been doing." She looked at her coffee. "Not as a cover, not as a placement, just the work." "That's it? That's enough." Paloma nodded. Then, "Are you going to tell me what Aldrin Pass is?" Mara looked at her. "You said the name in your sleep," Paloma said. "Once. About 3 weeks ago when you fell asleep in the break room after a double shift." She held up a hand. "I'm not asking for the details. I'm asking if you're all right." Mara was quiet for a moment. "It's something that happened," she said, "that I was part of, that I'm done being defined by." She paused. "I'm all right." Paloma looked at her steadily, with the particular kind of assessment that was no longer the wide-eyed nursing school look she'd had in February. "Okay," she said, and she meant it as the end of the question, which is what Mara needed it to be. They drank their coffee. The night was quiet. Spring came to Dunmore at roughly the same pace it came to anywhere in that elevation, grudgingly, in stages, with occasional retractions that suggested it wasn't fully committed. By the time the ground had softened enough to be worth commenting on, the federal proceedings related to Vreth's network were in early stages. Solace Meridian Group had been formally shut down by court order. Grayling had entered a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor's office and provided information that expanded the case considerably, and Harlow Military Medical Center had been assessed, repaired, and returned to full operational status with a security review that, among other things, identified 3 additional vulnerabilities that had nothing to do with anything Mara had ever noticed, which she found both sobering and oddly reassuring. The facility brought in a new security protocol consultant. It was not a job she was asked about, which was fine. She was asked about something else. The inquiry report, the formal federal panel report on the Harlow operation, had included a footnote, as inquiry reports sometimes did, about recommendations for institutional review. One of those recommendations, buried in an appendix, noted that the operational response during the Harlow incident had demonstrated the potential value of integrated combat medicine training for military medical facility staff and recommended that a formal program be developed and piloted. The recommendation had no specific author attached to it. She suspected Reyes. She didn't know for certain and didn't ask, because it didn't matter who'd put it there. It was there. 3 months after the operation, the facility administrator, a woman named Castor who had been in the administrative wing during the lockdown and whom Mara had spoken to through a conference room door in the dark, called her into her office and sat across a desk from her and said, "I've been asked to identify someone to develop a pilot training program. Tactical medicine basics, emergency response for non-combat medical staff, integrated crisis protocol." She looked at Mara. "I'd like it to be you, alongside your regular nursing responsibilities. You'd design the curriculum. You'd teach it. I'd give you the budget and the space and stay out of the way." Mara looked at her. "You were in the conference room," she said. "I was. I heard you tell us to stay put, and I'm glad we did." Castor held her gaze. "I'm not asking because of what I think you are. I'm asking because of what I watched you do." She paused. "You kept people alive by knowing things that most people in this building didn't know, and by being willing to be the person who acted on it. I want the people in this building to know more of those things." Mara sat with that for a moment. She thought about what it meant to be asked for something, clearly and without architecture around it, by a person who was looking straight at her and seeing what was actually there. Not the mechanism, not the placement, not the operator or the call sign or the 43 pages. The nurse who knew how to notice things and what to do when they mattered. Yes, she said, just that. Castor nodded once, the way people nodded when they'd gotten the answer they'd expected and were relieved to have it confirmed. The first training session ran on a Thursday morning in May, in the third-floor conference room that had been cleared and set up with a whiteboard and a training dummy and approximately 14 staff members who had come with varying degrees of enthusiasm and a common expression of uncertainty about what they were doing there. Mara stood at the front of the room with a marker in her hand and looked at them. Some of them she knew. Some she didn't. None of them knew what she was, specifically, which was fine. They would know what she knew, which was the relevant thing. We're going to start with assessment, she said, not the clinical kind, the kind that happens before you've even registered that something is wrong. The kind that keeps you 30 seconds ahead of a situation instead of 30 seconds behind it. She looked at the room. You already do this. You do it every time you walk into a patient's room and read the space before you read the chart. We're just going to talk about what you're actually doing when you do it. A woman near the back, a senior nurse named Ida, who had been in this facility for 12 years and had attended out of what appeared to be professional skepticism, said, "And why does that help in a crisis?" "Because a crisis is just an assessment you didn't finish in time," Mara said. "We're going to work on finishing them." Ida looked at her for a moment. Something in the look shifted. "All right," she said, "show us." The session ran 2 hours. People asked questions that were good, and some that were basic, and some that were the kind that came from a place of genuine thought about hard things. And she answered all of them with the same level of attention, because that was what the work required. When it was over, people filed out with the particular posture of those who had learned something they were going to keep thinking about, and Mara erased the whiteboard and put the marker away and stood in the empty conference room for a moment. She looked at the whiteboard, the clean surface of it. She thought about the 47-page file, about the 11 years before Dunmore and the 2 months since, and all the distance between the person documented in those pages and the one standing in a training room in Wyoming on a Thursday morning in May. She thought about how far a life could travel from what it was supposed to be and still arrive somewhere worth being. She thought about Hobbs calling her a rookie 37 times and then carrying a fire extinguisher up 2 flights of stairs on a broken leg. About Dwyer wanting to learn how to notice things. About Paloma pulling his suppression override because the label said yellow and she'd decided to be the kind of person who read the label. About Dacre saying go, just go, and meaning it. About the question she'd asked Harwick, is any of it mine? And the answer he'd given, which was the truest thing she'd heard in a long time, the nursing was hers. What she did with the placement was hers. What she did now was hers. She picked up her bag, turned off the light, and walked into the corridor. The ward was waiting. 42 patients, the ones she knew and the ones who'd come in since. New faces, new charts, new people who had their own versions of looking at someone and deciding what she was before she'd done anything. She was used to that. She didn't need them to know. She just needed to work, and the work needed her to show up and see what was there and do what the scene required. She'd been doing that since the first morning she'd walked into this ward. She'd keep doing it. She went back to her patients. Some people spent their whole lives waiting for the world to recognize what they were. They prepared for it, positioned for it, performed it, and when the recognition didn't arrive, they revised downward. Their sense of themselves, their ambitions, their willingness to occupy the full dimensions of who they were. Mara Voss had learned something different. She'd learned it the hard way, which was the only way certain lessons actually held. That what you were didn't need anyone's acknowledgement to be true. It only needed to be applied. The recognition, when it came, was a byproduct, real, meaningful, welcome. But it was never the point. The work was the point. The patient who needed the cultures reordered. The person on the floor of a dark corridor who needed a gauge pad and someone to say, hold that. The room full of people who didn't know how to finish an assessment in time, who would someday be glad they'd learned. The world underestimates quietly capable people every single day, and every single day those people have a choice, to shrink to fit the estimate, or to keep working at full size and trust that the work will eventually speak for itself. It was not a comfortable choice. It required things of you, day after day, that weren't dramatic or visible or acknowledged. It required you to know, without anyone confirming it, that what you were doing mattered. Mara knew. She went back to work.